MSNBC's Lawrence O'Donnell.
When I was working in the Senate, I didn't realize that it's the perfect training for the job that I have now. Covering government, covering politics, the complexity of it all. Mastering the detail is crucial to being able to present anything that happens in Senate buildings or any of the other news centers that we have to focus on every day.
The Last Word with Lawrence O'Donnell, weeknights at 10 p.m. Eastern on MSNBC.
Hi there, everybody. It's 4 o'clock in the East. It is the single most important decision in what could be the single most important election in the history of the story of our country. One that will affect our children and their children and generations beyond. And with so much on the line, whatever President Joe Biden decides to do with his campaign, to buck up or bow out, what he decides will shape the course of our American future, our American story. And let us underscore one part of what we just said. Whatever Joe Biden decides, that's where this decision lies, according to all the available reporting, with one person, President Joe Biden. Now, given the stakes, it's natural to hunger to know what comes next. But the truth is, no one really knows what comes next. And that appears to include the president himself at this hour. And we, as humans, are not good at this, the unknowing part. Joe Biden has more than earned the right to some space and some grace to do what he's doing right now. To try to reassure his campaign, to make calls to allies, to talk to his family, to sit with the data. We were told by officials that the data will shape and drive his next moves. The New York Times reported today, citing a single anonymous source, that the president told a key ally that he knows he may not be able to salvage his candidacy if he cannot convince the public in the coming days that he's up for the job after a disastrous debate performance last week. We should tell you, NBC News has not confirmed that conversation. The White House this afternoon vehemently denying it took place. Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre calling the New York Times reporting absolutely false. But where even a week ago we might have dismissed such a report out of hand, now it just adds to this feeling of uncertainty in this moment. For his part, the president, who now suggests that his debate performance was the result of global travel, is going about his normal presidential duties. This hour, he's expected to award posthumous medals of honor to a pair of Civil War heroes. We'll show that to you when it happens. Later this evening, he will meet with Democratic governors virtually and in person on this very topic, the state of his campaign. His staff is also trying to reassure others and themselves, apparently, that Biden 2024 is still all systems go. This afternoon, the campaign held an all-staff call with the president and vice president on that call. The topic was staying the course. That message, though, might best be directed at President Joe Biden's big donors today. Many of them have been waiting for reliable, accurate polling data before plotting their next choices, their path forward. Today, they got some of that. New data from the New York Times indicates that among likely voters, Donald Trump, who was already ahead, expanded his lead over Joe Biden by 6 points following the debate. Among registered voters, that margin balloons to 9 points. The figures on your screen are rounded outside of the slightly smaller margin of error. Notably, Donald Trump, a wannabe dictator who isn't hiding it, with a reflexive habit of posting everything and anything at all hours of the day, true or false, has been practically silent about the future and fate of Joe Biden's candidacy on social media. Whatever the reason for that, the threat he poses looms large and is not lost on President Biden's circle. As elected Democrats try to figure out what comes next, listen to how Congressman Jamie Raskin, one of the Democratic Party's most influential voices, describes this moment to our colleague Chris Hayes.
There will be lots of discussion and lots of people weighing in. And I know this is a moving target. It's got to happen quickly. But I can guarantee you, Chris Hayes, there will be massive unity and focus on that task when we get to the end of this process.
Every passing minute brings us closer to the Democratic National Convention and then to Election Day after that. So it's worth repeating. This is a profoundly consequential and sober moment in American political history. And to borrow a favorite phrase from President Joe Biden, quote, "That's not hyperbole." It's where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. The host of Politics Nation here on MSNBC, the president of the National Action Network, the Reverend Al Sharpton, is here. Plus, senior opinion writer and columnist for the Boston Globe, MSNBC political analyst Kim Atkins Stohr is here. MSNBC columnist and contributor Charlie Sykes is here, and political strategist, MSNBC senior analyst Matt Dowd is here. I would like to ask all of you, first I want to thank all of you for being here. This is a story that it feels like it antagonizes a lot of our audience. It's a very hard story to tell. I have mountains of admiration for the president and his family and what they've sacrificed in the spirit of public service. I also have a duty to cover this story wherever it goes. And I appreciate all of you being here. You don't have to be here. And I appreciate all of you being here. I want to share the reporting and then ask all of you to sort of help us make sense of it for our audience. President Obama, Rev, is reported to be looking at what I understand the White House is looking at, the data. And this is what the Washington Post reports. Quote, former President Barack Obama has privately told allies who have reached out to him that President Biden's already tough path to re-election grew more challenging after his shaky debate performance on Thursday. A harsher assessment of the presidential race in his public comments, according to several people familiar with his remarks. The White House was reported to have been waiting for this New York Times poll, which is why we led with it as well. And it is another blow, if you will, for the state of the presidential race?
Well, I think that aside from the polling, which could go up and down given whatever happens in the next few days, but I think that I certainly agree with those that say Joe Biden deserves the right and space to make his decision. Look at what he's been able to do as president. And I think he should not be rushed into a decision one way or another. Secondly, I think that we're on the eve of the 4th of July. When we saw what the Supreme Court just did in terms of the powers of a presidency, I don't know how we celebrate the 4th tomorrow without really making a campaign issue. Can we even risk having someone who has openly said he wanted to be a dictator on day one, openly said he wants retribution, to sit in that chair while we have a constitutional crisis with this right-wing Supreme Court? So I think more than the New York Times poll, the Supreme Court decision changed everything for a lot of people. We cannot risk that. Whatever the president decides, and I certainly think it's an awful standard to have, say, now one bad debate, now you're out of the race. I don't know whether we can sustain that throughout the rest of presidential history, that now if you just blow it one time, you're out of the race, unless there are other underlying circumstances. But I think the Supreme Court decision has to be front and center. And I think media needs to talk more about that than to talk about some debate and the polling, because America changed yesterday and we're getting ready to have barbecue when the Supreme Court has just barbecued our rights.
Does that, I appreciate your point. I agree with your point. We spend a lot more time on the Supreme Court than we have on the state of any race, the presidential or otherwise, Rev. So I associate myself with your opinions on this. But I want to ask you what conversations you're having.
I'm having conversations with a lot of people, some off the record, and most of them have said that they think that President Biden will carry on and he will go forward. I've also had some that said they're hoping that he will go forward. I've not had any civil rights leaders or people that I've talked to in government that said he should step aside. But even more telling, I do a syndicated radio show every day, and I maybe had one caller out of 50 or more that I handle over 2 days or 3 days, maybe 20 callers a day. Only one has said he ought to step aside. I think that the public really became incensed at a lot of what Donald Trump had to say. This whole thing of black jobs and the lies he told. I think, and many of them watch your show and talk about how you fairly parsed that out, because people are ignoring the offensive stuff that was said. I was disturbed when Joe Biden couldn't finish one or two sentences. I was more disturbed with the sentences Donald Trump did finish.
Yeah, it's a great way. It's a great way to underscore what is actually in front of the voters. Matt Dowd, it was your job to read polls. And I have to say, to the Rev's point, if a debate performance shaped presidential political history, George Bush never would have been elected. He bombed his first debate. I think at least 2 of 3 of the debates against John Kerry. So that is also true. But I don't want to ignore what voters are saying. I care a lot less about what the press is saying, what the polls are saying. But it is also true, and it is a painful truth, that there are a lot of people concerned, not just about a debate performance, but about Joe Biden's age. What is your counsel for this campaign in this White House?
Well, I'm really glad we're having this conversation, and I'm really glad you started it off about saying that we need to give Joe Biden grace and space. I think we all deserve grace and space at any moment in our life, and so especially the President of the United States. I mean, I think what this has done is it's elicited an incredible emotional response in this moment because the stakes are so high. And in many people's minds, especially the people that are watching the show, our democracy is at stake. And as the Reverend said, the Supreme Court decision even underlined that even more, because basically it's the Supreme Court said that Donald Trump wants to be a dictator, and we're going to let him be a dictator. That's basically what the Supreme Court allowed and said and gave permission for in the course of this, which is incredibly scary, and it's understandably emotionally in the course of this. To me, there's two separate issues to look at. The one, the grace and space for the president. And I, for one, am not one that calls for that he needs to step down. Or I don't think others should, that don't have influence over the process or over his decision. It's going to be his decision and his decision alone. And there's very few people that will have influence over him, to him, in that process in the course of this. One, whatever we say is not going to alter the course of what Biden does in the course of this. And so, in fact, I think many of us and pundits, if we get out there and say he should step back, it's actually going to have the reverse effect of what people want, because I think people are going to dig in the course of this. And so I just think that's one part of the conversation, and the president will make that decision. The other part is the polling. And I will disagree with something that Reverend said, and I agreed almost 99% of what he said. This isn't about one debate. The problem with these sorts of things in this environment that we're in is that debates can confirm narratives, either positively or negatively. And what the debate did for Joe Biden in his performance was confirm a narrative that developed. He's too old. He's not competent. He doesn't know what he's doing. And then when he has a debate like that, it confirms that negative. And for voters, especially passive or disconnected voters who are only getting bits and pieces of information, they had a narrative already, and it confirmed that. And all the polls have shown that there is a large group of the public that doesn't think the president, and whether we agree with it or not, the public thinks this, doesn't think the President Biden is up to doing his job in the course of this. I would say when you look at all the polls, the New York Times poll is important, and I would look at likely voters in the course of this, is that the race has moved 2 points or so to Donald Trump's credit in the course of this, around 2 points. When you look at all the polls, some are better, some are worse, but it's about 2 points among likely voters in the course of this. Most people say, oh, that's not anything. The problem I think fundamentally is that this is not a race like 2004. And I was there. You and I were both there at the debate, the first debate that George Bush had against John Kerry. And you remember we were in the back room, and I said, if you send me out there to talk to the press, I'm going to tell them that George W. Bush just lost the debate. And so I either go out and tell them that, or I don't go out at all. And I remember you said, don't go out and tell them that in the course of this, which I didn't. I didn't say a word in the course of this. George W. Bush lost 4 points in that first debate. Yeah. The problem today, and people say, well, Joe Biden's only lost 2 and George W. Bush lost 4. The problem is that we were trading in the margin in 2004 around 10 or 12 points. There was about a 10 or 12 point margin you could trade in this. Today, the margin you're trading in Joe Biden versus Donald Trump is about a 5 point margin. And so when you lose 2 points in a 5 point margin, that's incredibly significant. And I think the fear that many have is that Joe Biden, if something happens that again confirms this narrative, if he's in an interview and he stumbles, if he's at another debate and he stumbles, it's only going to lock in more solidly the perceptions of people that people have in that. And that's, I think, the difficulty. They're going to look at the polls. The people that are going to have influence are going to weigh in privately to the president of the United States. That's some members of Congress, and that's people personal to him. President Obama, I think, is one of those people that can weigh in the course of this. But let's not, fool ourselves. A 2-point or a 3-point drop in a 5-point margin delta is significant, and it needs to be taken account in this perilous time and moment we're in where the stakes are so incredibly high.
I'm so inspired by all of your candor and depth. And so I want to follow up with you, Matt, and then Charlie and Kim, I'll bring you in on the other side of a break. I feel like one of the other structural things that the campaign folks are going to look at, Matt Dowd, and the reason they pitched this debate, this was the Biden campaign's idea to have this debate on this day done this way, was because unlike in 2004, there aren't a lot of opportunities to reshuffle the race. They're outside events, but nobody can plan for any of those. And if there aren't any debates, I mean, there's one more, I think, scheduled for the fall. The conventions haven't really been huge movers on either side in terms of reshuffling the race. Do you see a lot of opportunities to reshuffle the race in President Biden's favor?
The only other opportunity, and this is what's dicey, the only other real opportunity is the next debate, is the debate in September. That's really the only last and best opportunity. I think his giving an interview, which I think is scheduled with George Stephanopoulos on ABC News, I think is important. It's not going to reshuffle the deck of this problem until you get millions of people watching another debate and they can see, well, that was a one-off. Joe Biden really is, here's what he is, and here's who he is. And so we're okay, and we're confirmed in that. It's not going to be fixed. I'm sorry to tell people in campaigns, it's not going to be fixed by television ads. It's not going to be fixed by a rally in Raleigh. It's not going to be fixed on any of those things because the audiences and are too small, and the people question television ads because they know they're scripted and they know they're just canned, and they discount them, and they've been discounting them for the last 20 years, the effectiveness of television ads in a presidential campaign. The problem is, so if we say the next best and only opportunity is in September, that's after the conventions and that's after ballots have their people's names on them. And so to me, though we can't hurry up Joe Biden in making this decision, they're on the clock in the course of this, and they need to make a decision, I think, relatively soon, whether it's 5 days, a week, or whatever it happens to be. I don't think it can go all the way up to the day the convention opens, because after that, there's no fixing the problem up until the next debate. And if that doesn't go well, it's probably Katie bar the door.
And that seems to illuminate Jamie Raskin's comments, which I found startling at the moment I saw them live. But that seems to sort of support or be the similar view that Jamie Raskin was articulating. I want to spend as much time with you, Kim, and you, Charlie. I have to sneak in a break first. We'll have that conversation on the other side. Also ahead for us, as the Rev alluded to, we'll turn to the Supreme Court conservative supermajority's decision. It has sparked a democratic crisis in this country. Today, there's a real push to make sure the court doesn't go any further than they already have in this last term. We'll talk with the group stepping up those efforts and that campaign about how they do that. Later in the broadcast, more on what absolute immunity for a president could look like for Donald Trump if he's reelected, especially when it comes to U.S. national security. That SEAL Team 6 scenario looking like an alarming reality to some intelligence experts. We'll talk about that and more when Deadline White House continues after a quick break. Don't go anywhere today.
MSNBC's Lawrence O'Donnell.
When I was working in the Senate, I didn't realize that it's the perfect training for the job that I have now, covering government, covering politics, the complexity of it all. Mastering the detail is crucial to being able to present anything that happens in Senate buildings or any of the other news centers that we have to focus on every day.
The Last Word with Lawrence O'Donnell, weeknights at 10 p.m. Eastern on MSNBC.
a U.S. senator destroyed by blackmail.
He was not bound by the truth or by facts.
The country's most outrageous political demagogue, ascending toward the peak of American power.
Millions upon millions of devoted followers.
This is a story of heroes willing to face down tyranny and the risk to the country if they fail.
Rachel Maddow presents Ultra, Season 2 of the chart-topping original podcast. Listen now on Spotify.
We're back with the Rev, Kim, Charlie, and Matt. So, Kim, the piece of it that I think is so traumatic for the Biden coalition, which is the only political coalition in our country's history that defeated Trumpism and Trumpists, is that there is no symmetry. There's no remorse. Mitch McConnell, who referred Donald Trump criminally for prosecution, which he couldn't even do now because the Supreme Court, he had as strong of a hand in shaping as anyone other than Donald Trump, said presidents are immune. They just fell back into line. They already function as though they live in an autocracy and Trump is an autocratic leader. This sort of raw pain and anxiety that I think President Biden's coalition is living in is also this feeling of just how brutally unfair the process is. There's a lot of hatred for the media. I don't know what other word to use. But people should know that the Biden high command is engaging with the media. I mean, this is not a story that's been fabricated, but it is a story that feels deeply unfair to a lot of folks in the Biden coalition.
That may be true. Listen, you're absolutely right that the difference between Republicans and Democrats is that Donald Trump could have fallen unconscious on that stage and still gotten the support of Republicans that he has now. That solid support that allowed him to coast to the nomination. Democrats, listen, it is not my job to be a spokesperson for Democrats. It's my job to say what is needed to protect our democracy from the existential threat that is Donald Trump, and that is voting for Democrats right now. And right now, instead of rallying behind the president or even saying, I support the president or whoever the nominee will be, and in this moment, you have Democrats, not just privately, but publicly bickering and fighting with one another about what should be done now. This far past the primary, when what is the alternative? Nobody is asking. The question is, okay, what if Biden steps aside? What now? Have we seen how Democrats handle open conventions or anything close to that? Do we remember 1968 when Johnson decided not to run again? How did that end? That ended with the election of Richard Nixon. Did we see 1980 when jittery Democrats thought maybe that Ted Kennedy can come to the rescue? How did that end? With the inauguration of Ronald Reagan. Even in 2016, not an open convention, Hillary Clinton won it. I was there in Philadelphia when you had so many Bernie Sanders delegates booing and crying and kvetching as she accepted the nomination, many of those doing things like voting for Jill Stein. And how did that end? With the election of Donald Trump. Jill Stein got more votes in Michigan than the difference between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton in that state. Democrats don't do that well. What Democrats need to do is take a page from Republicans and say, we understand the existential threat that we are facing. We are seeing a presidential candidate who already is saying he will be a dictator from day one and who believes, falsely, but he believes it, that the Supreme Court just gave him absolute immunity. We have a president who cognitively bragged about being able to say person, man, woman, camera, TV, but who stood on television and told everyone to inject disinfectant and is now doing campaign rallies about, electrical currents and sharks. And nobody is doing an hour-long press conference asking him about that, the way we saw the hour-long press conference asking 1,000 ways about Joe Biden's cold. Democrats need to buck up, look at the threat, and fight against that threat and stop fighting against each other. Our democracy depends on it, and time is up.
Kim, I'm going to need you to say a little more.
Listen, it's just really frustrating because I understand what people saw in that debate. And I understand exactly what Matt said. What that did was confirm a narrative. But who spun that narrative about Joe Biden not being fit for the job? Republicans did. His opponents did. And what Democrats are doing now is confirming that based on their reactions to what's happening. Listen, I get donors with all their money who get jittery when polls move. And I even also get elected lawmakers who are so focused on their own reelections and being down ballot from Joe Biden that they may not be acting completely rationally. But we need everyone, including the press, to speak very clearly about the threat that we are facing. And that is a threat to democracy itself. Have we forgotten that Donald Trump fomented an insurrection? Have we forgotten that he has been found by a court to be a sexual abuser? Have we forgotten all of the racist, xenophobic, and nonsensical things he has said? Have we forgotten how fearful he was when we were when he was at the helm of a pandemic response? And most importantly, for Democrats, have we forgotten that they have a candidate who has had a successful administration, who has seen wages rise, who has seen inflation fall? Yes, it's not fast enough for everybody. It's not perfect. Our economy is not perfect. But I remember during the Trump administration when every economist was promising us that we would have a post-pandemic recession. Guess what? We didn't have any. Guess what? People had their student loans forgiven. Guess what? We have fewer border crossings right now when Republicans refuse to back border security because Donald Trump told them not to. We also have a vice president who we haven't even mentioned yet, Kamala Harris, who stands ready should anything, God forbid, happen to Joe Biden. She stands ready to step in. She will stand ready to step in next term, too. And all of this talk about him stepping aside because he can't perform 4 more years is tremendously disrespectful to her. What I want is for Democrats to get a grip and to fight. That is what this moment needs, not hand-wringing and public bickering about this.
I need you to say one more thing about Kamala Harris. I see something in some of the reporting that a benefit of the doubt she never gets as vice president, which is newfound confidence, not just in her governing abilities, her championing and warning about reproductive freedoms, but of her as a candidate, which is amazing, Kim, to your point.
That is absolutely right. I mean, the galvanization that this White House did in the aftermath of Dobbs and ensuring that the administration did everything within its power to protect the reproductive rights of people and to organize with governors in states that believe in reproductive rights to give them everything they need to do the same, such as, in the state of Massachusetts, stockpiling mifepristone before it got banned. Was driven largely by Vice President Kamala Harris. She is on the job. She is visible. I think a lot of reasons people are saying, where is she, was in part because you have a news media that hasn't been focused on her. For whatever reason, they have made their decision not to do that. She is there. She is doing the job, and she will continue to do the job. And she will continue to be there as a partner in every bit of the successes in this administration to carry them on. Again, God forbid if anything happened to Joe Biden. We have seen her attacked from the right with, misogynoir assumptions, again, confirming a narrative that somehow she is not qualified, she is not able because she is a woman of color. That is not true. And so Democrats who know her, who have seen her at work, can also get behind her and tell that narrative too, as opposed to publicly fretting. I need Democrats to fight. If Democrats had half of the fight in them that MAGA Republicans had backing Donald Trump, we'd be in a different situation.
On that note, Charlie Sykes.
Well, deep breath here, because this fretting and this bickering is what democracy looks like. And at this point, Democrats do need to fight, but they need to fight for democracy and they need to fight for the country. And they need to put the country over the party and any individual. Look, the reason we're having this conversation is because Donald Trump is such an existential threat to this country. The Supreme Court raised the stakes exponentially. The reason we are having this, what you want to call a hand wring, is because it is so urgent. And we are also committed to not allowing a second Trump presidency, which I think is even more dangerous than it was before Monday. But the reality is that Joe Biden has to face, 2 major questions. And the American people do deserve answers to this. He has to answer the question and prove to the voters that, number one, he has what it takes to beat Donald Trump. It's not enough to simply rally around someone who, in fact, is going to hand the presidency to Donald Trump. So that's number one. Number two, tens of millions of Americans have real questions about whether or not he is fit to be president for the next 4 years. We can roll our eyes at that, but these are, as we were discussing, as Matt mentioned, this has been a narrative for some time. Polls have shown that people have had doubts about that. That New York Times poll today says that 3/4 of American voters right now think that Joe Biden is too old to be president. So the question Democrats have to ask is, if Donald Trump is an existential threat to democracy, if democracy is on the ballot, are you willing to risk it all on a man that 3/4 of Americans think is too old? Now, Joe Biden does have this time to turn it around. And I think he deserves that opportunity. And what does he have to do? He has to do these long form interviews, like the one he's going to do with George Stephanopoulos. He's going to have to do unscripted press conferences. His White House is going to have to release credible and transparent medical information about his condition. He's got to reassure the country. Now, if he did all of those things, it doesn't necessarily solve the problem. As Matt mentions, look, he may, I'm being told, well, he has good days and he has bad days. The problem is that after last Thursday, in a presidential race where the stakes are this high, he cannot afford any more bad days because the scrutiny is there. I will say there's something else that we ought to lay on the table here. The reason we are here today is because I think that there's been a lot of denialism, and I think that there has been a lot of gaslighting. And I think that the Biden White House has a credibility problem, because I think that a lot of Democrats turned on that debate and they had been prepped to think that he was going to show up, he was going to be vigorous, he was going to be tough, he was going to take on this guy who was erratic, this autocrat, this guy who was notoriously unprepared. And when Joe Biden shuffled out there and was turned in the performance that we all saw, people were shocked. And I think you have to ask yourself, why were we shocked? Were we misled? Was there a bubble around Joe Biden? What do we not know? What have we not been told? And I think in a democracy, we need to ask these questions and we need to have answers to these questions because, number one, I think, the American people deserve to know what their president can do. But also, folks, the fight here is not about Joe Biden alone. The fight is about saving this country from another Trump term. So that's why they have to answer these questions. So he's got to do those interviews. He's got to have the press conferences. And then, as Matt mentioned, he's got to do it over and over and over and over again. And after that convention, the risks keep rising. So the question is, how much do you want to gamble the future of American democracy on this? And quite frankly, I don't think it's disrespectful for Democrats to say, would we be better off with Kamala Harris? Would we be better off shaking this whole thing up? One of the reasons why Donald Trump, I think, is so quiet is because he wants to see how this plays out. But in the mind of Donald Trump, look, I know a lot of Republicans are going to say, oh, we would love to be able to run against Kamala Harris. We would beat her. But the reality is that would be a dramatic change in the dynamic of this race. So I'm not saying what Joe Biden should do right now, but I'm saying, whether he should get out of the race, but he needs to do certain things and he needs to do them urgently. And one last comment. We are now a week out from that debate, and he really hasn't done any of those things yet. And I think that's a cause for concern. And I think there ought to be more questions. Why have we not had that press conference? Why did we not have that interview? Why are we not getting this medical information from the White House? Because the clock is running on this.
Charlie Sykes, Kim Stohr, the Reverend Al Sharpton, Matt Dowd. I'm always grateful to all of you for the things you share, but especially today. Thank you so much for starting us off with your wisdom and candor. We're grateful. Also today, Donald Trump, again, saying the quiet part out loud, underscoring everything everyone has said about the stakes in September. He actually praised the Supreme Court for giving him the power to escape any and all accountability for his criminality. how groups are mobilizing right now to ensure reform at the High Court is on the table. That story's next.
Nearly 250 years ago, America was founded in defiance of a king, under the belief that no one is above the law, not even the president. Until now. The same Trump Supreme Court that overturned Roe v. Wade ruled that the president can ignore the law, even to commit a crime, because Donald Trump asked them to. He's already led an insurrection and threatened to be a dictator on day one. Donald Trump can never hold this office again.
It's a chilling warning, a brand new ad from the Biden campaign out this morning on the binding damage this Trump Supreme Court has unleashed on the country with its new decision that presidents are now completely immune from prosecution for their official acts. The immunity decision from the Roberts Supreme Court brings even greater urgency to the movement to impose some semblance of ethical standards and impartiality on this highly politicized court. One group, Demand Justice, announcing a $10 million investment to, quote, advocate for Supreme Court reform and prepare for the effects a second Trump administration could have on the judiciary. It cannot come soon enough, as the dangers for our democracy posed by Monday's decision are already coming into sharp focus. Yesterday, Donald Trump posted on social media that the ruling amounted to, quote, total exoneration, Trump claiming that it would end all legal prosecutions of his efforts to violently overthrow the U.S. government, ending, quote, the impact of the immunity ruling is a loud and clear signal for justice in the United States. I am proud to be an American. Joining us now, President and CEO of Democracy Forward, Skye Perryman, and Executive Director of Fix the Court, Gabe Roth is here. Skye, give us some hope. Tell us what you're working on and how what can be done. What can be done? I think the Supreme Court is front and center for November, no matter what happens in our political world.
Well, the hope is that the vast majority of the American people expect a court that is going to protect them, that is going to protect the Constitution, and the vast majority of people in this country believe in the potential and promise of democracy. But we do have some work to do because this term, the court showed that the majority of its justices are a threat to democracy, doing everything from granting the president unprecedented immunity, akin to a king, to undercutting yet again women's health and the health of people in communities. And so we are really focused on enabling people to make their voices heard in this critical moment.
Skye, say more about what the effort looks like with the money funds.
Well, certainly the money that was announced by Demand Justice is going to be focused on mobilizing core constituencies, people who have been hurt by this court. Moms and families have been hurt by a court that continues to leave women's health in the balance, making it unsafe for our kids to go to school because of rising gun violence that the court continues to not curtail. And then even
we're going to work on Skye's connection. Gabe, I want to pull you in on this idea that Ruth Ben-Ghiat has stuck in my head that I can't get rid of. That I ask everyone, do you remain optimistic? And she said, I have to, because the despair and the feeling that there's nothing that can be done is a tool of the autocrat. It's what they want you to feel. And I think about that with the Supreme Court, because they really lean into the idea. And I think it's why they resist any ethics. We're different. We don't need ethics, and there's nothing you can do. And it feels like the Senate Judiciary Committee, which is right now today run by Democrats, gives them that power. And it's the first page of Timothy Snyder's On Tyranny, right? It's what the authoritarian, it's not what they grab violently, but what is given to them. And I wonder if you think Monday's decision changes any of the calculations by the Democrats who lead the Judiciary Committee.
That we're living in now. It has to change the calculus. And I think it needs to do so on a few different levels. Number one, we the people are not powerless. Our representatives in Congress are not powerless to push the court and to push the lower courts as well, but specifically the justices to do more, to be held accountable. And I think part of this is kind of like, there's probably a sports metaphor in here, but you don't really gain that confidence until you start racking up wins. And what we've seen in the Senate Judiciary Committee, it's basically lost in the Leonard Leo subpoena effort. That isn't happening. It got a scant amount of information from Harlan Crow when he was subpoenas, or in exchange for the effective dropping of that. The bill, the Supreme Court Ethics, Recusal, and Transparency Act that passed out of committee that would have an enforceable code of conduct was voted out of committee successfully, but they tried to run it through the Senate via unanimous consent. And obviously, the Republicans were going to just raise their hand and boom, there goes an unanimous consent, and the bill is dead. I think that asserting that power is something that they need to do. And the wins that I'm talking about are pretty simple. For example, last week, Jamie Raskin, Democrat from Maryland, introduced a bill that would require the justices to follow the same gift acceptance rules as members of Congress, nothing over $50. I would love to see that come to a vote on the House and Senate floor, Senate more likely given that it's run by Democrats, and have Republicans tell their constituents back home why they believe that Supreme Court justices should be accepting all of these gifts. So that's number one. So I think it's racking up these small wins like that. And even if it only passes through one House, I think it's something that might be worth running on in November. So that's not step one. And I think step two is messaging. We have an opportunity to really hit home, hit the justices and talk about what they have that we, the people, should have instead. So that, to me, that's three things. One, that's time. The justices have way too much time on the court, and we need to enact term limits to get them off the court quicker. Number two, it's money. The Supreme Court is given $150 million by taxpayers each year. If you take out their salaries, which is required under the Constitution, and their security, which they obviously need, that's still about $75 million that they have for a law clerk. So see how they like not having law clerks write their opinions and not getting catered lunches every day. And number three, that's power. I think that we need to push an agenda that would strip some of the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, make it easier for Congress to override Supreme Court's statutory decisions, and also have rules that make it harder for nationwide injunctions for a single judge to have so much power and change a presidential or congressional directive. So I think that if we focus on the time, the money, and the power reforms, then I think we'll be in a better place come January of 2025.
All right, we're just scratching the surface here. Skye and Gabe are sticking around. We have to sneak in a quick break. We'll all be right back. We're back with Skye and Gabe. I mean, Skye, what the part of the story about the Supreme Court that I can never fully process and understand is why they're not interested in being part of the solution. We've talked a bit about poll numbers today. The Supreme Court is the institution that should be worried. On the question of justices are impartial, 28% of all Americans believe that the highest court in the land has impartial justices on it. Justices are politicized, 70% of all Americans, and that is the Associated Press. Why do you think they're not at the table with you trying to negotiate or compromise on a series of reforms that would help them?
The majority of justices on this court, unfortunately, are a product of a far-right legal movement that has been active in seeking to undermine the well-being of people and communities for so long. And so this isn't about the rule of law. It's not about justice as it should be. It's not even about our Constitution. It seems that it is about brutal power that is harming the lives and well-being of millions of people throughout the country. That's what I'll say in response to that. I'll also say if this Supreme Court term was not an indication of it, I don't know what is. But there is no cavalry or institution that is coming to save the American people in this crisis. It is going to have to be we, the people, that can save us. And our Constitution does provide those tools. And we are really focused on making sure people are making their voices heard, that we are demanding of our lawmakers that they represent people and fix this problem.
Gabe, when you look at the public opinions on this, I mean, it is the softest terrain. It is the most unifying agenda. Supreme Court reform. You've got 70 to 76% of all Americans who oppose their decision on Dobbs. I think it's upward of 80% who oppose their decision on bump stocks. And then you look at presidential immunity. I haven't seen any reliable polling on that since Monday. But the vast majority of Americans see themselves exactly the opposite of what they decided on Monday. The national identity is cloaked in this idea that no one is above the law. The Supreme Court on Monday said, nuh-uh, yes, they are. Donald Trump is.
Yeah, and I think this is something that the Biden White House has fallen down on the job on. I testified before the Presidential Commission on Supreme Court reform, I think actually 3 years ago this week. Have not heard from the White House since. I think I had one call with the Vice President's office on some of these reform ideas. And I'm not the one pushing the most partisan reforms. Term limits are supported by 70% of the public, about 60% of Republicans and 80% of Democrats. And, it's kind of surprising to me that this issue, which seems very winnable, my organization's a C3, we don't deal with elections. But, speaking as a private citizen, I believe that this is a very winnable issue for Democrats. And, we can be upset about, Roe or any of the immunity cases or what have you. But I just don't see a reform agenda coming from the White House, coming from leading Democrats. And, it's going to be hard to convince voters that are going to turn up in November if you don't have a positive vision for what a future court looks like. And I haven't seen that from, the party that's in the White House right now.
Skye, is that part of the space that you're hoping to fill?
Well, I think what we want to make sure people understand is that people have the power, and we cannot give way to this cynicism, especially in a year where it is all on the line. Democracy, our freedoms, the well-being of people. We have to demand that our lawmakers do better, but we also have to make sure that people have representation in the courts, that they are making their voices heard. And that is what this effort is going to be about. We are going to mobilize people across the country to stand up for the freedoms that they themselves know and believe in, that this country was founded on. And, we're not going to let the Supreme Court or any institution undermine democracy in this time. I think that's really what we are focused on.
How much of that, Skye, is warning of what would happen if the polls hold and Trump prevails again in November?
Well, again, we view these threats as very deep in terms of the right-wing networks that are out there. You have the head of the Heritage Foundation or a representative from their foundation on television, I think yesterday, saying that they are calling for a second American Revolution, and he cannot promise that it will not be bloodless. This is what's happening on the eve of the 4th of July in America today. And so we do believe the threats are extreme, and the American people feel that, and we'll be focusing on mobilizing folks around those issues, and also making sure that people understand that there are tools. Our Constitution provides tools in this time of crisis for the American people to protect and advance democracy.
Skye Perryman and Gabe Roth, two people we will continue to turn to. I think the term may have ended, but the political earthquake that it put in motion is just beginning. We will continue to call on both of you. Thank you so much for joining us today. Up next for us, more on what broad immunity for a president like Donald Trump would mean. National security and intelligence experts are sounding the alarm today. Deadline White House continues after a quick break. Don't go anywhere.
Saturday, September 7th, it's MSNBC Live Democracy 2024, our premier live audience event with your favorite MSNBC hosts. Visit msnbc.com/democracy 2024 to buy your tickets. Stay up to date on the biggest issues of the day with the MSNBC Daily newsletter. Each morning, you'll get analysis by experts you trust, video highlights from your favorite shows.
2024 is now truly the most important election in the history of our country.
Previews of our podcasts and documentaries, plus written perspectives from the newsmakers themselves, all sent directly to your inbox each morning. Get the best of MSNBC all in one place. Sign up for MSNBC Daily at msnbc.com.
One might argue that it isn't plausibly legal to order SEAL Team 6, and I don't want to slander SEAL Team 6 because they're honorable officers, and they are bound by the Uniform Code of Military Justice not to obey unlawful orders. But no, I think one could say that it's not plausible that that is legal, that action would be legal. And I'm sure I've thought of lots of hypotheticals. I'm sure you've thought of lots of hypotheticals where a president could say, I'm using an official power, and yet the president uses it in an absolutely outrageous manner.
And yet, here we are. Hi again, everybody. It's now 5 o'clock in the East. It was raised as an extreme, trivial, almost silly and absurd argument during oral arguments before the Supreme Court just a few months ago by conservative Justice Samuel Alito, no less, to show what could come of the ex-president's demands of absolute immunity, a scenario so unthinkable, so unimaginable, that it reportedly drew laughter in that very solemn place, the Supreme Court. Cut to the political and legal earthquake that was ushered in by the court's decision on Monday. That same court essentially giving permission to that worst case scenario, a president using his office to order the assassination of a political rival without the backstop of the threat or promise of criminal law and prosecution. Experts are now warning about what that absolute immunity looks like on every level of government, especially national security. The court's opinion, as Politico reports, did not attempt to directly carve out such extreme examples, and that immediately raised alarm among national security experts. The majority instead accused the dissenting justices of, quote, fear-mongering on the basis of extreme hypotheticals. The liberal justices, in their dissents, painted a grim portrait of what we could be looking at in 6 months' time. Justice Sonia Sotomayor wrote this: if presidents, quote, orders the Navy SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival, immune. Organizes a military coup to hold on to power, immune. In every use of official power, the president is now a king above the law. Justice Sotomayor wrote that. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson acknowledged the president may have the authority to remove the attorney general, for example, but, quote, the question here is whether the president has the option to remove the attorney general by, say, poisoning him to death. More from Politico's reporting, quote, the biggest challenge for a president ordering an assassination would be finding the military personnel willing to carry out the order, legal experts explained. While the president himself would have the protection of immunity, others involved would remain vulnerable to prosecution because the Supreme Court's decision doesn't make the underlying act legal. If they are given an illegal order by the president or by someone who is directly answering to the president, they may be in a position that they are subject to court-martial in either direction. That's according to Claire Finkelstein, a professor of national security law at the University of Pennsylvania. A lawless president, however, could get around that problem by promising to pardon anyone who carried out his orders. It is not an unlikely scenario for ex-President Donald Trump, who already promised pardons for carrying out illegal orders when it came to border security, whose alarming suggestions or even rhetorical questions about shooting protesters in the legs could play out entirely differently now. That already happened too. This also happened. It was former Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman General Mark Milley, who told The Atlantic this: if Trump, quote, ordered us to do X, Y, or Z and it was legal, we would do it. If it's not legal, it's my job to say it's illegal. And here's why it's illegal. All that, at best, murky now after the Supreme Court's decision on Monday. It's where we start the hour with some of our favorite experts and friends. Former Assistant Director for Counterintelligence at the FBI, Frank Figliuzzi is here. Former CIA Director, now MSNBC Senior National Security Analyst John Brennan's here. Former Acting Assistant Attorney General for National Security at the Justice Department, MSNBC Legal Analyst Mary McCord is here. Mary, I'm going to ask you to start out by just kind of explaining your old job. I mean, national security is, in pop culture, more closely associated with the CIA, right? But its hub really is at the Department of Justice. Explain why, and explain how Monday's decision makes that even more the case.
So, the Department of Justice, the Attorney General, Deputy Attorney General, they're part of the president's national security team, along with people like John Brennan when he was the director of the CIA, the director of our intelligence community agencies, and all of the national security agencies. And they sit together at the White House in the Situation Room in a SCIF, a sensitive information facility and talk about national security issues of all sorts of flavors on a daily basis. And the president seeks the advice not only of his legal advisor within the National Security Council, but also the advice of all of the principals who are part of that national security community. And the Department of Justice, also through its Office of Legal Counsel, is a really important part of ensuring that the proposals that are brought to the president, the policy proposals, the actions are consistent with law. That's domestic law and international law. And I will tell you, in my experience, the premise that undergirds the majority opinion here, that in order for presidents to act fearlessly and boldly in our national security and other matters, they can't be chilled or cowed by the prospect of criminal prosecution. That's just not what is driving these discussions about how to respond to national security issues, whether they're defense-related issues, intelligence-related issues, terrorism issues, or so many other things that come before the National Security Council and the president on a daily basis. So this notion that you need to provide this broad criminal immunity to ensure that presidents can do their job, I think that's just a fiction. I think that was an excuse to write such a capacious ruling that expands presidential functions, what are called in this decision core executive functions that derive allegedly from the Constitution. This capacious, expansive ruling really doesn't have any grounding in our constitutional text or our history, and it's not warranted by any kind of practical necessities. And one other thing I would say is this opinion also seems to assume that we have other functioning remedies for a president who does something that is so, meets the criteria that Justice Alito talked about. But those other methods, things like impeachment, those have failed us in recent years. So the notion that now there is no backstop, that's why you have people so concerned about this opinion.
So, Director Brennan, tell me how this happens operationally and functionally if the president of the United States, as Trump did last time he was president of the United States, wants to do something illegal. And his lawyers, I think Don McGahn, sometimes said, hey, no, that's illegal. He actually would write that down, have his note taker, Annie Donaldson, write it in her notes too, and then send him a memo saying you can't, for example, prosecute Hillary Clinton and Jim Comey because it's illegal. We know a little bit less about what he wanted to do at the intelligence agencies. We know a little bit more about what he wanted the military to do. At some points, jail migrants. At other points, invoke the Insurrection Act. At other points, seize voting machines. But if he's not stopped by the fear of the consequences of criminality, what happens?
Well, a lot happens, and it's not good. It's hard to be shocked during these abnormal times, but I truly was shocked by the breadth of this Supreme Court ruling. As Mary noted, there are legions of lawyers in the government to ensure that all the actions that the government officials take are going to be legal. And when a president is going to authorize some type of action, whether it be a covert action or some type of military action, there is rigorous legal review that is done at the White House by the legal counsel, but also by the interagency lawyers group to ensure that every order that a president gives is going to be solidly anchored in the law. And this is not to protect a president's, eventual criminal liability. It's because, at least for the 6 presidents that I served, all of them wanted to make sure that everything that they did, everything that their administrations engaged in, was going to be lawful. And so the president of the United States is the chief executive of the executive branch. And so, as Mary's mentioned, the breadth of this ruling is really quite astounding. And I don't think the justices who voted in support of this ruling really understand the implications here, because the president heads up all the departments and agencies in terms of military personnel, law enforcement, intelligence, homeland security. There are so many different opportunities for there to be some type of nefarious action that a president would authorize. And as was pointed out in your lead-in, it's possible that a president could, in fact,
issue preemptive pardons to those individuals who would carry out this unlawful act that a president alone is immunized against some type of liability, but they are not unless they actually are giving a presidential pardon. So again, the scope of this, the implications of this, especially if a lawless, corrupt president is going to be in the White House, it is really quite chilling in terms of what could happen.
You know, Frank, we also cover Trump like he's a question mark. He's an answer. He's answered it. He wanted to break the laws. He wanted to have evidence manufactured. He wanted Don McGahn to make up things that didn't exist to get out of criminal exposure with Mueller. He wanted Border Patrol agents to do illegal things, and he dangled pardons in front of them. We also know what he already did at his Department of Justice when it came to wiretaps. We found out at the end of his presidency that he was listening to all manner of journalists. He was listening to lawmakers. What does this absence of any semblance of fear of criminality, how do you assess what Trump would do in a second term with all of the awesome powers of the FBI?
Yeah, as you said, he's told us what he's going to do. He's already done some of it. As it's engraved in over the National Archives in Washington, the past is prologue. Exactly. The past will tell us where we're going in the future with him. And I often think, as I'm contemplating what the impact is on the national security community with this ruling, at first, my reaction was, boy, we're going to have a lot of people in the intelligence community doing unlawful things. But then I stopped myself and I reread the opinion. And it's worse than that because we've redefined what lawful means in this ruling. So, we're all worried, it's going to be unlawful. Oh, we'll have unlawful. No, if the president says it's lawful, it's in the scope of his official duties, his core duties. He's consulted with his attorney general or his Department of Defense secretary, then it could be deemed lawful. So it's not the unlawful acts that I'm worried about. It's the so-called lawful acts that he's going to go forward with. And with regard to Sam Alito's concept that, the dissenters are just talking about extreme hypotheticals, none of this is hypothetical. We need only go back in history to the mid-1970s and the discovery in America that the FBI and the CIA were spying unlawfully on our citizens domestically. And then the Senate had to convene something called the Church Committee, named after Senator Frank Church. And what did that committee, which sat for over a year, what did they discover? There was systematic spying outside of all judicial rulings, no court authorizations. There were black bag jobs, which means break-ins and illegal search warrants by the FBI. There was wiretapping, unlawful wiretapping of anybody deemed a threat by J. Edgar Hoover, including Martin Luther King, including trying to convince King to kill himself, including the FBI, by most historians now, findings, that coordinating with an intel unit at Chicago PD to actually murder a Black Panthers leader. Right? All of this extrajudicial, there were no rules. So when anybody says, don't worry about it, things will work out. No, we've been there. We've been there. And now we have rules that came out of that church committee that actually are the operating guidelines for the FBI, for the CIA. But things had to get very ugly, literally murdering somebody deemed a threat because the FBI director thought the guy was a threat. That's where we're headed here.
Well, and with Trump, there's always a projection, right? I mean, it always struck me as bizarre that he described the court-approved search of Mar-a-Lago to retrieve classified material they'd asked for somewhere between 8 and 15 times, a, quote, assassination attempt. It's clear that Trump already thinks along these lines. What has to be considered a threat that they would have to contend with inside the FBI right now if Trump's reelected, Frank?
Well, the first thing among the first things that Trump is going to do, of course, is replace the FBI director, even though, by the way, he's a Republican and a Federalist Society member. But, he's not moving quickly enough or as radical enough for for Trump. So he'll go. But beyond that, you're going to see the top echelon of the intelligence agencies, the inspectors general, the DNI, all pledge loyalty to Trump. Their rank and file may lose their civil service protection, so they'll be extremely fearful. And I'm telling you, if you think Trump's threats and intimidations have not impacted decision-making, just look back at the Washington Post reporting about searching or not searching Mar-a-Lago and realize that they were yelling at each other, DOJ and FBI executives, about, this isn't going to happen on my watch. So, talk to Andy McCabe, as I did just a couple of days ago on my YouTube show, who's being threatened by Steve Bannon to charge him on some bogus charges and extradite him if he flees the country. How do you put mechanisms in place right now to stop that from happening? I don't have an answer to that.
We, Director Brennan, have covered for 8-9 years now the threats to the rule of law. Is it dead? Did it die on Monday?
Well, it's certainly closer to death than I think it ever has been before. And if we think that a Republican Party would try to limit what a Donald Trump might do in terms of unlawful activity, I think that is just very unrealistic in light of the fact that I think most Republicans in Congress feel quite constrained by laws, that they haven't been able to achieve their objectives and their agendas because frequently they are limited by those laws. And so if they have then someone in the White House who has this ability to basically do anything under the official authorities of a president and will not be held liable for it, I think they will just be cheerleaders for him. And so as both Frank and Mary said, again, the scope of this, the breadth of this, the implications of this are truly profound. And it's only if we have people in the White House, like a President Biden or President Obama, who truly respect the rule of law, as opposed to somebody like a Donald Trump who continually has been frustrated by the limits that the law places upon him. This is going to be quite concerning in light of the fact that we may very well see a Donald Trump emerge in November's election on top. God forbid.
Yeah, I mean, if a fair read of the polls today suggests that is at least a possibility we have to rumble with. Mary, I want to ask you a question about whether there's anything. I mean, what's interesting to me is nobody from Monday to whatever today is, it feels like it's been 11 days. It's only been 3, has worried about what Joe Biden would do with this absolute immunity, right? All of the coverage and all of the commentary is about what Donald Trump would do. And my colleague Rachel Maddow said, this is binding. This is it. This is the law of the land now. And so what we have to do is make sure that Donald Trump is never, ever, ever president again. Something Liz Cheney also said in almost the exact same words. What, if anything, can be done to shore up the office of the presidency in these, last months of the first term of Joe Biden's presidency?
So it's such a great question, because what you're pointing to is what, we've been, lamenting now for several years as dying, which is sort of norms and the rule of law, because not everything that makes up the rule of law is about a statute that Congress passed or a constitutional provision. There are long established norms. And that's really why I think President Biden, even with this new ruling that would, theoretically allow him to take some of the outrageous actions that we're now talking with concern about potentially happening in a future administration. I mean, this is a man who I cannot see doing that because of the norms, right? Because this would be so outrageous, such an abuse of executive authority, so corrupt that most presidents, at least in our modern times, have felt bound by those. Their advisors feel bound by those, right? And they also feel like they have an obligation to the American public not to engage in that kind of outrageous conduct. But norms, of course, those don't have any binding effect. And one of the other things I would call attention to in this opinion is it also seems to really limit the power of Congress. And it's very detrimental to what our entire constitutional structure of separation of powers is built on. When the Chief Justice writes about the preclusive effect on Congress of the executive's core functions, again, read very, very broadly, he's basically saying Congress he's saying Congress lacks authority to criminalize things that are within this area of very broad executive powers. And that means, what happened to checks and balances? The authority of Congress under the Constitution, under Article 1, to legislate and to conduct oversight seems to be also imperiled by this ruling if you really look closely at what the court is saying here. And so think about things like limits on the president's military authority, right? The Posse Comitatus Act that makes it criminal for our military to engage in domestic law enforcement unless the Insurrection Act is invoked. But why would any of that need to happen? Why would the Posse Comitatus Act ever apply to a president if being the commander in chief and being able to issue orders to your military is such a core executive function that Congress can't act to limit it? So this is like, when we get into this nitty gritty here, it's hard for me to answer the question about what can be done to shore up the guardrails, because the opinion is so exceedingly broad.
So we're going to do two things. I mean, one, the answer is nothing. And two, we're going to get into more of the nitty gritty, because I think our audience is pretty well steeped in the litany of crimes Donald Trump either committed or sought to commit. I want to press all of you on what that looks like should he be reelected. There's much more to get to with our experts, our national security experts, on the implications of Monday's immunity decision from the Supreme Court and the alarming prospects of what it would mean if someone like the twice impeached, 4 times indicted, criminally convicted ex-president should ever return to office. Plus, with the growing specter of autocracy in America and the big decisions now facing President Joe Biden, one thing is abundantly clear: we are living through a perilous, unprecedented, anxiety-inducing moment in American history. We'll try to put the events of the last week in historical perspective, find some reason to hang on to hope later in the broadcast. Deadline White House continues after a quick break. Don't go anywhere.
How is the system going to work if intelligence officers are going to try and decide whether this president is going to be trustworthy? Like, how does that work if those people who are honor bound to give it to the president now say, but I don't know whether this guy can be trusted. He might take it. Do they start making choices about what they share and what they don't? And so the whole system breaks down.
We're back with Frank, Director Brennan, and Mary. Director Brennan, just elaborate on how the immunity decision exacerbates what Sue Gordon's talking about there.
Well, I think we already saw, seen with Donald Trump, his reckless disregard for security practices in terms of how classified documents are going to be handled and stored, which is what I think she was referencing there, because the individuals at the CIA, FBI, and other places that really put their lives in the line in order to acquire the information that is necessary to keep this country safe really will wonder whether or not what they provide to a Trump White House is really going to stay classified and not be shared broadly. And so I do think it undermines the credibility of the system in terms of the intelligence community, law enforcement, justice are supposed to have a very trusting relationship with the chief executive. And if that trust is not there, and if there's concern about what the chief executive might be doing, now with the Supreme Court ruling, a chief executive could also be engaged in unlawful activity, utilizing and leveraging the information or the capabilities that they have. So again, thinking about this in the context of what we've already seen Donald Trump do and say, and what he is likely to do and say if he returns to the White House, I think that is why so many national security experts are deeply, deeply concerned and disturbed that this Supreme Court ruling, combined with a possible Trump second term, really is a threat, I think, to our national security.
Frank Figliuzzi, how would you, if you had to profile the court, I mean, they offer no specific example of when a president couldn't do something bold. Some members of this court were there during the Obama and Bush presidencies, which were, frankly, both hallmarks of the national security, were bold, questionable in the case of the Bush administration, terrorism, counterterrorism policies. The court offers no example of where anyone in modern or ancient presidential history has been reined in, but they have this language about they need to be bold. And they also ignore all the real examples. We're talking about an ex-president who incited a deadly insurrection across the street. We're talking about an ex-president who stole classified documents and refused to give them back. What is your best guess or your best theory of the case on what happened here?
I must have missed the part in the Constitution where the president must be bold. That's interesting. The part of the Constitution that I recall is that I took the same oath when I joined the FBI that the president of the United States has, which is to preserve, protect, and defend the United States and the Constitution. So, look, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. I view the Supreme Court as a national security issue. And the certain members that we're talking about, there is an agenda here. They went out of their way. I'm perfectly fine with disagreeing with a Supreme Court decision. Heck, I went to law school. I can argue both sides of anything, right? But that's not what they did here. The reason we're dissenting so much for this is they did things they didn't even have to do. You know, when one of Trump's lawyers during the argument for this decision said, yeah, I guess there are the business of alternate electors and fake electors. Yeah, I guess you could say that's a personal, private, non-official decision. They said, no, it is actually. It is. So they gave him more than he asked for. They went out of their way to make this happen. So what do I conclude as an investigator? There's an agenda among some of the Supreme Court justices. And quite frankly, when they speak privately at so-called private speeches to groups and organizations, they're at dinner after a few drinks, we hear the agenda. For Samuel Alito, it is the belief that America's going to hell in a handbasket, and we need to take a more theological theocracy approach to running the country. We know Amy Coney Barrett, even she had to go off and write her own summary and decision, but she came from what is essentially a cult-like background where the cult had to approve who she married. This is, you can't tell me this is not an agenda.
Mary, the government and the people who work in the government are not sort of in the DNA of people who work in the government. They're not wired to be political actors. Those are the very people Trump wants to purge first, based on the blueprint provided in Project 2025. What would happen at DOJ, for example, if he carried that out?
I mean, that's part of the concern, because normally I might respond to an opinion like this by saying, look, the president can't really do anything alone, right? If it's a military operation, he needs the military. If it's, weaponizing the Department of Justice, he needs the career prosecutors to go along with it. It might be that he puts in his, an AG and a deputy AG who are willing to take the power of prosecution and use it against political enemies. But there would be a lot of rank and file who would refuse to do that. But you layer on top of that the promises about Schedule Left, right? This idea of converting sort of all the career civil service, and that includes the Department of Justice, to essentially fireable without any protections. And then you have the potential of really cleaning house of those who would otherwise stand as guardrails against an overreach or a weaponization of the Department of Justice or of other agencies like the IRS, for example. Now, you just can't clean house completely, right? Or the functions of government will grind to a halt. So even though that's a threat and it's out there, at some point, I think even Mr. Trump, should he become the next president, is going to have to realize that there are some functions that just have to keep continuing. And the American people really, really would be upset if some of those things end. Things like Social Security payments, right? And various things of that nature. So I'm a little torn, because I think that, some of our best guardrails are in our career federal government employees and our career military. And so, threats to one of those is really a threat, to so much more than that. But I do think, I was reflecting on the break on your question about what can we do to shore things up. And I think part of that is really to provide, good legal opinions for military officers, good legal opinions by experienced civilian military experts about what's a lawful order and what's not. Give those generals, if they are asked to do something they think is unlawful, give them the power that they need to look to their lawyers, and those lawyers the sources and the resources that they need to be able to give opinions that can keep some of those guardrails. And similarly within even places like the Department of Justice, the IRS, and other places. I mean, again, some of this is going to be based on norms, but shore those up as much as possible so that we can hopefully rely on our career folks across multiple agencies to stand up against what might otherwise be, some really horrendous overreach.
I'm just thinking back to Trump's presidency where no one was too high or low on the food chain for him to single out by name, by family name, and smear on his massive social media platform. So I take your point that that's what we could do. You can't see it holding up to the power of a completely criminally immune American president. But we can hope. And we can hope that doesn't come to pass. Frank Figliuzzi, Director John Brennan, Mary McCord, thank you so much for having this conversation with us. When we come back on the eve of July 4th, it's safe to say we are at a pivotal moment in our country's history, from the critical decisions by the Supreme Court that we've been talking about, the growing threat of authoritarianism as the platform for the Republican nominee for president, to whatever decision may be ahead of President Joe Biden. We'll try to put it in some sort of historical perspective after a very short break. Don't go anywhere. Whatever your feelings are in this moment about our politics or the way forward for the only political party in America running on the ideas and policies that guarantee we continue to live in a democracy, I'm guessing it includes at least some parts worry and fear. It is often helpful to turn to our own history to see if there are any lessons to draw from or reassurances to be offered from those who came before us. For that, we turn to our next guest. Joining our conversation, presidential historian, professor of history at Rice University, co-author of the Nixon tapes, Douglas Brinkley is here with us. Also joining us, former RNC spokesman, host of the Bulwark podcast, Tim Miller is here. Doug Brinkley, we are in need of some perspective. Tell me how you see this moment.
Well, thank you for doing that on the Supreme Court. It's important to give that a lot of airtime. And happy 4th of July to you, Nicolle, and to all viewers. Look, this is a big crisis going on for America. Joe Biden has to decide whether he has lost his own narrative. Whether this debate is so seismic that he can't really glue it back together. It's not a time to be Rocky or I'm a boxer, you're not going to knock a Biden down, he always gets up. It's not about Biden's personal narrative. He has to have a truthful talk to himself, with his wife. Can I really be a full board president 2 years from now, 3, 4 years from now? We're not electing somebody for a few months. We're electing them to 4. The decision is in Biden's hands. I see some good signs talking to Democratic governors, but they have to talk to the state DNC level people, the ones that are dealing with the constituencies. There's a lot of disgruntlement with DNC leaders state by state. So they're going to have to cast a wide net and find out what's going on. But I think they're trying to eat up the clock on Biden to stay in the game. The Stephanopoulos interview will be important, but he'll have to follow it up with 2 or 3 more interviews, and I think stage a town hall or 2 and restore confidence in his presidency. After all, Harry Truman dropped out in 1952. There wasn't confidence in him. It was said to err as Truman. He had, 30% approval rating, and Lyndon Johnson in 68 bailed, not just because of the Vietnam War, but also because of health concerns. And he brought in a lot of elders like former Secretary of State Gina Acheson and others who said, you're not popular. And a burden on Biden, it was something that he's been grumpy about, is he feels the press, just like Lyndon Johnson felt the press, or Harry Truman felt the press loved FDR. Why don't they love me? LBJ felt the press, loved Kennedy, but why not me? And we're seeing that kind of a feeling of kind of blaming the media by Biden. And that's never good for a president. You have to float above that media fray and not try to say that what's been a largely friendly media to him, by and large, over the last 4 years is the ones that's to fault for him not doing the Super Bowl interview or for him botching the 90-minute CNN debate.
Tim Miller, it is an extraordinary moment. A lot of our viewers are very angry. They're angry that we have this conversation. I want to share with you, though, something from the author of On Tyranny, Timothy Snyder, which I read in 2016, but I went back and read it when I was on maternity leave this year and came back. And he was one of the first people I talked to. He and Ruth Ben-Ghiat and Ian Bassin are sort of my touchstones in pushing all of this through an authoritarianism versus democracy filter. I mean, I think if we have to cover the Republican convention, it's no longer adequate for the press to put on a former Democrat and a former Republican. It should be a former Democrat, a former Republican, and an expert on authoritarianism. Trump is running as an out and proud authoritarian, and the Supreme Court on Monday gave him a huge assist. So with that as sort of my purpose, let me read you what Timothy Snyder tweeted today. Quote, unless Trump loses, America ends. The Supreme Court has made this clear, as has Trump himself over and over. Our enemies know this, which is why they all, without exception, support Trump. We have no excuse not to know this. And once we know it, we can act, each of us doing what we can, trusting one another, making contact. We can do this. If we each do what we can, this republic will go on, and this republic will get better. I want to show you one more piece about the despair and the feelings of hopelessness. This is Ian Bassin on this program on Monday about despair as a tool of the authoritarian.
Despair and fatalism are the tools of authoritarians. So by adopting that perspective, we actually concede the territory. And democracy depends on a sense of agency and a sense of possibility and a sense of hope. And so I do still have those things.
Hope and agency. I do still have those things. Do you still have those things, Tim?
Absolutely. I love Ian Bassin. I love Tim Snyder. I'm glad that you started with both of those. And I've been reading On Tyranny as well. Here's the thing. I've been reading that as well, On Tyranny. And I understand the anger. I do. I understand the finger pointing. I understand the frustration. There are people that are on side with you and me, Nicolle, and our new team that are like, wait a minute, like, why are you bringing up concerns? We got to all be rowing the same direction. But here's the thing. It is because of that threat that Tim Snyder laid out that it is absolutely critical that in this moment, we make sure that we, as a unit, as a pro-democracy unit, which is very unwieldy, which goes from Liz Cheney all the way to Bernie Sanders. It is, we're not always going to agree on everything. And so right now we have to determine what is the strategy to combat that tyranny that can win. Because right now we just have to be honest that we are on a losing trajectory. You can say that you don't believe the polls. Maybe some of the polls are wrong. Maybe they are. But they're not biased against Democrats. The polls right now show that Joe Biden is losing, but Democratic senators are winning in the same states. So something is amiss here, right? And I agree, everybody's got to play their role. And from the Democratic convention to November, let me tell you, everybody is going to be rolling the same direction. But in the meantime, we need to make sure that it's part of everyone's role is to make sure that we have a unit that can combat this threat. And that includes the person that is supposed to be leading the unit. And this is, I think, the frustration right now with the president and his campaign team. And it is, we need them to be leading us into battle, leading us into charging, the charge of the light brigade. And we're getting a lot of nothing. We're getting a lot of finger pointing. He is in that interview yesterday that Douglas mentioned with George Stephanopoulos. But that's 8 days after the debate. If you look at Obama's campaign schedule from June of 2012 or McCain's in 2008 or Biden's 4 years ago, it's much more vigorous. And so if Joe Biden is going to lead this charge against tyranny, we need a vigorous campaign that everyone can get behind that recognizes we have to change trajectories because right now we're on a very dangerous one. And I understand that some people don't like to hear it. I don't like to say it. And I totally get it. But that's my perspective right now.
We have a lot more to get to. I want to come back to the Supreme Court. I have to sneak in a quick break and ask both of you to stick around till the other side.
There's great alarm in the country about this decision. I mean, it's hard to believe that the alarm could be heightened, but this one really shows a radical break from more than 2 centuries of understanding of the president's role. And it's as if they are trying to set the stage for Donald Trump's new monarchical presidency.
We're back with Doug and Tim. Doug, one of the consequences of the political turmoil happening in this country is that conversation hasn't been 24/7. And this is our 6th hour of the week. We have 2 hours a day. We've probably spent 4.5 on the Supreme Court decision. But the truth is they ended the rule of law in America. I mean, it's pretty hard to argue that it exists in any way that resembles what we had before Monday's decision. I'm sure the decision was done before Monday, but before it became known to the public and the world. Frankly, we haven't begun to scratch the surface of what the world thinks of an America whose president is functionally a king. That's not me saying it. That's one of the Supreme Court justices who dissented. What, in your view, are the aftershocks of Monday's decision should Trump prevail in November?
It's just deeply alarming what the Supreme Court did. Representative Raskin's not overstating it at all. I mean, we now have an imperial presidency on steroids in the making. We can call it a king, you can call it a despot, you call it a monarch, you call it authoritarian rule, but it's not in the spirit of the founding of the United States. 248 years ago. This is not what Jefferson or Hamilton or Adams had in mind. They were trying to stop this sort of powerful chief executive to the point where if you really go back, there hasn't even been much executive power in the 19th century up until Lincoln's emancipation. It is true in the 20th century, presidents started doing executive orders in a grandiose way and was a slippery slope to this. But this is a radical right-wing Supreme Court. History will look at Hillary Clinton's loss to Donald Trump 2016 as the epic moment that allowed Trump to be president, that allowed him to become the election denier, but most importantly, that allowed him to put these 3 Supreme Court justices on, and it's smashing our democratic impulses in this country. But, the Democrats, and that's where it gets connected in history is, there are Democrats that worried about why didn't Ruth Bader Ginsburg step down earlier and grab one of those seats? And that's what's being connected to Joe Biden now on age. We've got to get an American offensive spirit, backing our Constitution, believing in our government. The poll number on how many people like the U.S. federal government are so low, it's frightening. And so, yes, I do think we just can't sulk. We need a leader to take on Trumpism. And the question is it Kamala Harris or is it Joe Biden? But one way or the other, we've got to amp it up because this Supreme Court's not going away. And giving this new recipe to Donald Trump is a nightmare in the making.
Douglas Brinkley and Tim Miller, for your candor, for your wisdom. Thank you very much for spending some time with us today. Another break for us. We will be right back. On the eve of July 4th, as we prepare to celebrate our Independence Day, the country we sought our independence from is having its own election day. British voters are set to elect a new prime minister and parliament, and the polls suggest it will be a landslide there, knocking the Conservative Party out of power after 14 years. Economic turmoil and numerous political scandals. They will likely be handing the keys of 10 Downing Street from current Prime Minister Rishi Sunak to Labour's Keir Starmer, the leader of the UK's centre-left party. Labour hasn't won an election since 2005, but the polls suggest that they could pick up more than 430 of the 650 seats in Parliament. We'll keep one eye pointed across the pond on your behalf. Another break for us. We'll be right back. Thank you so much for letting us into your homes during these extraordinary times. We are so grateful.
A U.S. senator destroyed by blackmail.
He was not bound by the truth or by facts.
The country's most outrageous political demagogue, ascending toward the peak of American power.
Millions upon millions of devoted followers.
This is a story of heroes willing to face down tyranny and the risk to the country if they fail.
Rachel Maddow presents Ultra, Season 2 of the chart-topping original podcast. Listen now on Amazon Music.